important later in my story, because he was running messages back and forth when he was going to be a baker, and then coming back on the to go to sleep at night. So he had a double job, and I had nothing. I just had a good time.
Now, what happens when the Nazis took over in Vichy in late 1942?
In late 42, oh, I have to intersperse before that a period with where I got to see my father again. When the Germans took over in Brussels, they arranged for the Belgian police to round up every foreign national who was in the country and put them into a camp. They took all the Jewish people, both Belgian and foreign nationals, and put them in another camp. So if you were not Belgian and were Christian, you were left alone. But if you were Belgian and Jewish, even the citizens of Belgium who were Jewish were put in the same camp as my father and all the other non-Belgian citizens. So you lost your, we had no statesman, we had no citizenship anyway. Those had been taken away from all the Jews in Germany and Austria and Czechoslovakia anyhow. But this was different. When the Nazis finally occupied all of France, or the part of France that they did occupy, and made the arrangements, they decided that they would make a German-speaking camp in France and a French-speaking camp in France. The French-speaking camp had all the folks from Paris and the biggest communities. And then they put a camp called Camp Gurs, which was somewhere in the Bordeaux region, which was occupied by the Nazis. But this was run by the French, who was serving the Nazis. And they brought my uncle, my aunt, and my grandfather from Baden-Baden, which was where we owned our hotel, and my father, who was in Belgium, and they were all in the same camp. And I have some pictures that you've been seeing that show all that. So that, you know, there are a number of images of my father and my cousin had been born in that camp. And the reason that child was born in the camp and did not basically get destroyed immediately was because my uncle was the cook at the hotel, and so he became the cook of the camp for the policemen, the gendarmes, and they never kill a good cook. And he had been a French chef, so he, as well as a kosher chef for our hotel, and so his wife survived. They arranged to get his wife, when she was in delivery, to the hospital in Paris, where the child was born. But, and my grandfather, of course, was part of his family. He was my mother's father. So they all lived through the war in that camp and actually went back to Paris, and he reopened the restaurant in Paris. My father, in 1942, we saw him in March, but in late, early fall, August, September, my aunt got a note from him that he was being, or we got a note from my aunt, and saying that he was being relocated to the east. And by 1942, Auschwitz had been built, and so that's where he wound up on, I think, the second or third transport from France. He went there and was immediately murdered. But I saw my father, and in 42. Now, when the Germans took over in Vichy, then obviously it was time to leave because they would not be bribed. So I wound up being put in a convent. The older children wound up escaping over the border with most of them to Switzerland, where they suffered various fates. If they actually were young enough and could prove they were young enough, they actually were allowed in a displaced camp. If they were over 16 and couldn't prove they were under 16, they were sent back. And then they tried to escape again because, you know, but a number of them were caught and a number of them wound up being killed. Although of the 100 children, more than 90 of us survived the war. only 10 were lost. I was in a convent for a few months before then leaving for Toulouse, where my brother, because he had been in the underground, was able to contact them and arrange for us to be smuggled or crossing over into Spain, which was at that time a neutral but fascist country that if they caught you at the border, they would send you back. But if you got across the border safely, you had to stay hidden because they would turn you into the Germans. And we did. So we were we escaped over the Pyrenees.
How long did it take you to make that trip? Do you remember?
3 days with no food or water. We ate snow, and we slept during the day and traveled only at night. And when we got to the farmhouse, the safe house, they served us a frittata. I remember this Spanish omelet frittata today as distinctly because I hadn't eaten for 3 days and I was hungry as could be. They also served us straight white wine, Andalusian white wine, which of course I'd never had.
And what did that do to you?
And that made me totally blotto. I fell drunken asleep under the table and slept there all night. And then in the morning we had to race to catch our train to Barcelona. And I was puking, making in my pants. I mean, I smelled bad, I looked bad, I felt terrible. But we made the train.
Who arranged, by the way, who arranged the safe house?
That was done by the underground, the French resistance. They paid back my brother basically by providing this escape route. And then the Jewish community in Barcelona, who were Spanish people, so they were not given up, but any foreign national would have been given up. They ran this house. It was a Jewish couple. And I remember being on the top of one of the 7 hills, the one the Olympics were actually on. And that's all I remember because we couldn't really leave the house. So there were a lot of steps down the mountain. And I, of course, tried some of them, but I got caught a few times. So I had to stay up on top of the mountain for 2 months. And then we escaped illegally by train to Portugal, Lisbon. Because by then we knew that we had someone who, my uncle, had sponsored the papers. And by 1944, the United States had relented and was giving out some visas for people who had family in the country. And since my uncle was in America, they got us, my brother and I, visas to come to America. Now you have to get to Portugal. And so that's why we took that risk. During that trip, which I remember vaguely from the original time, but which I took again when I was in my 50s as an American tourist, I was terrified. I was told not to talk because I didn't speak any Spanish or Portuguese. I was told not to get out of my chair. So for 45 minutes at the crossing where the guards came with their dogs and their guns, and they came on the train. It took 45 minutes to change train conductors and train engines and things for the Portuguese gauge. I said nothing. My wife looked at me when I made the transition from France to Spain when I came back many, many years later. During that 45-minute transition, which I believe was exactly the same people with the same dogs and the same guns, came on board. I said nothing. I sweated. I gripped my chair, but I had an American passport. I was having a big camera around my neck. I had nothing to fear, but apparently I reverted. So that was still in me.
Now you also took a trip back to Vichy, right?
Yes, I went back, basically retraced my entire route. I took the train from Frankfurt to Brussels, and I remembered the same station. I went from Brussels to Toulouse. I went from Toulouse with a car this time to La Ile, and then I took the train from in Carcassonne to go to Barcelona, and then from Barcelona we went home. We didn't go to Lisbon, but I'd been to Lisbon during my career in the solar energy business, and I'd gone to the synagogue. My brother had been bar mitzvah, and there was an older woman in her late 60s who had put me on the boat to America, and she said, "Manfred," because that was what my name was. I remember you. You were the worst kid in the 20,000 I put on that boat for